Hello, everyone. I'm here with Shahid Buttar, who is running probably the most high-profile race in the country right now against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So, Shahid, thank you for being back with me. It doesn't feel like that long since we spoke last time, but I wanted to ask, how's the race going?
It's going better than I frankly had expected in my wildest dreams. I've been really humbled and grateful for all the support that's come to our campaign, particularly in the last few weeks since Bernie Sanders suspended his for the White House. And I do think that a national movement around the country recognizes that even if we don't have the opportunity in the presidential race to vindicate our principles, that we still have that chance in down ballot races. And again, I'm very grateful for the chance to be among the voices of our movement receiving that support.
So, what would you say are your greatest challenges right now as an outsider candidate in the middle of a pandemic?
The biggest one is the pandemic. I was just going to go straight there because it keeps us from pursuing traditional campaign tactics like knocking on doors and hosting events and volunteer mobilizations. The second biggest challenge, I dare say, is the corporate media and the construction through corporate propaganda of a figure of the speaker that is wildly divergent from her actual record in office. And Nancy Pelosi, unfortunately, in Congress does a great deal to serve Wall Street and to pave Trump's path. And you'd never know it if you watched MSNBC. So I would describe corporate propaganda as one of the particular obstacles that we are challenged by, because at the end of the day, much of our campaign is a public education exercise to show San Franciscoan voters how we have been represented in Washington for the last 20 years. Nancy Pelosi has retained this seat largely through a combination of corporate fundraising that intimidates potential opponents and a corporate propaganda machine that construes, again, a false impression of her record in Washington. And I'm looking forward to debating her, exposing that record, and liberating this seat.
So then, I guess this sort of gets at what you were just saying, but how do you deprogram people from this sort of cable news narrative? Because cable news definitely does have its own narrative. I mean, legacy media does have its own narrative. I would say that most journalists have their narrative that they push. So how do you deprogram people?
I wouldn't say that's something that I, as an individual figure, can do. This is why social movements are so important. This is why, frankly, voices like yours and independent media sources are so important. This is why it's so important that each of us who care about the future talk about it with our neighbors and our friends and our colleagues and our family members and our classmates. The discourse to unplug, to reprogram, as you say, people to de-brainwash ultimately can't come from a single source. It has to be a community effort. And I do think that we are living in an era where the discourse around these issues is wider and deeper than, frankly, it ever has been in my lifetime. And it's one reason why I'm so confident in liberating the seat. I know that I'm not the only person concerned about Nancy Pelosi's support, for instance, for corporate lobbying firms instead of universal health care. I know I'm not the only one concerned about Speaker Pelosi settling for body shaming the president when she should be opposing his policies. And the fact that so many other Americans share those concerns, share the same information, I think that getting that information out through all of our various channels, social media, online, we do a weekly live stream that's part of our effort to educate folks. Our calls to voters, we have hundreds of people phone banking for us at any given moment. We hope to grow that into thousands. And that'll be a crucial part of the strategy to help educate our neighbors and correct the record, the misinformation promoted by corporate sources about how we've been represented in Washington over the last generation.
So let me ask: we in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the Democratic relief effort, the machine sort of roll into DC. The HEROES Act, named for the essential workers that are working through this pandemic. Schumer promised that it would be Rooseveltian, and when it came out, we found that it contained provisions that could potentially cut pensions for essential workers, that it did not have a national rent freeze, that it did not have monthly assistance, that it had means-tested rental assistance, that the rich could get bigger tax deductions, which was something that Nancy Pelosi herself fought for, the lifting the SALT cap. So I wanted to ask, do you think that sort of facing perhaps the worst crisis in their lifetimes, do you think that weighs on voters, that helps your effort when they see the aid that's coming in is inadequate?
Certainly. I think it certainly helps us with voters. The question is, how much can we get out to people to critique? On the one hand, I'm very grateful that Congress has appropriated trillions of dollars to pump into the economy. That is important stimulus. And as you noted, particularly in the latest measure, it is apparent that even those stimulus measures put Wall Street first. And the abandonment of any pretense to even look for universal health care. I mean, we are in the middle of a pandemic right now. Millions of Americans need to get to a doctor and they need medicine and they can't get it. And it would seem to me that if we're responding to the pandemic, that would be a logical place to start. Rent and mortgage payments right now are pushing lots of families to the wall. And exactly, the means testing program doesn't meet the need. There's a further piece here, I would say, in terms of the Paycheck Guarantee Act that Pramila Jayapal introduced from Washington. And it's striking that Congress, under Nancy Pelosi's leadership, refused to support a measure supported not only by the Progressive Caucus, but also by moderates who Pelosi usually hides her conservatism behind. And the idea that even moderates are outflanking Pelosi on the left exposes, I think, the conservatism of her voting record. At the end of the day, what, your question is it going to help us or not? At the end of the day, the question is, does San Francisco want to be represented by a voice who fights the Trump administration, or instead a powerful careerist who entrenches the Trump administration and enables him while mouthing merely rhetorical, performative so-called resistance? And I'm very confident that San Francisco wants to both fight the right wing under this administration and fight whoever comes next. I mean, the landscape of presidential nominees at the moment are decidedly disappointing with respect to progressive interests. And whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, I anticipate in Washington needing to fight an administration from the left. And that's what I'm here to do. And I think that's the voice that San Francisco wants in Washington.
So this is an important election, and obviously it will come down to enthusiasm and turnout. Do you think it makes it harder for you or easier with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket? I mean, obviously your opponent is a Democrat. So, I mean, it could go either way, right?
It goes either way, and even the influence of Joe being at the top of the ticket goes either way. I certainly would prefer for Bernie to be the nominee, particularly because we need his voice and his vision now more than ever. And frankly, because he's the strongest Democratic nominee. If we want Trump out of the office, we should go to the nominee with the most support, not the one who is the presumptive nominee only because everybody else dropped out and rallied behind him to block the nominee with the most support. But aside from that dynamic, if I just look at my race, Bernie being at the top of the ticket would create a wave that I and other down ballot progressives could serve. And that's another reason why I would prefer him at the top of the ticket. With him not on the top of the ticket, though, it also creates opportunities for us. Ironically, I did not anticipate the now reality that I would be in this race and that Bernie would not. And the idea that Bernie is off the field, I think a lot of people around the country are looking for voices to vindicate our vision, to represent our movement, and to challenge the establishment. And I've been doing that, and I'm going to continue doing that. And I had hoped to do that as a lieutenant in Bernie's army. And even if he's off the field, I'm very happy to step into whatever leadership opportunities are available. I'm very humbled by the chance, even as I'm running to represent San Francisco in Congress, to have already stepped into the role of helping represent our movement on the national stage. And, if Bernie were on the ticket, I think that's better for all of us. And with him not on the ticket, it did create this opportunity for my voice that, again, I'm very grateful for, humbled by, and I'm eager to translate that into a seat in Congress to continue fighting for our movement inside the halls of Washington.
So let's talk a little bit about something else that happened recently, this FBI surveillance bill that I'm sure you have some thoughts on. It contained some provisions like no on letting defense attorneys read FISA wiretap applications, no on outside review of government arguments on surveillance applications, but except in exceptional circumstances that concern First Amendment religious liberties or candidates for federal office. But it did extend criminal penalties for not following procedures. So what are your thoughts, and how did that get through a Democratic House?
Yeah, the House adopted, under Nancy Pelosi's leadership, the most extreme version of surveillance that was on the congressional table. Ironically, the Senate actually outflanked the House to the left by rejecting a clean reauthorization of expired Patriot Act surveillance powers. And it's striking that Pelosi continued her pattern of supporting unconstitutional surveillance in secret by federal agencies unaccountable to the public by supporting a measure without amendments. And I'm particularly frustrated by the fact that several provisions of the Patriot Act did in fact expire this spring, and the House, under Pelosi's leadership, is now scrambling to revive them. It was a major victory for civil liberties this spring, and it was frustrating, frankly, that nobody knew it. The expiration of these Patriot Act powers happened to coincide precisely with the pandemic, which offers an interesting juxtaposition that's worth highlighting. The reason we've been peddled the false, the snake oil, let's say, of government surveillance for the last 20 years is supposedly because we needed to keep us safe, right? What we are told is that if we don't have these surveillance measures, people will be at risk. People might even die. And I have a news flash for Washington and for Nancy Pelosi. People are dying right now by the tens of thousands. There's no terror attack in our nation's history that even rivaled, even by a remote long shot, the deaths that the pandemic is causing. You can't stop a pandemic with surveillance. You can't stop a pandemic with a fighter jet. You can't stop a pandemic with any of the things that we are hurling taxpayer funds at. The only thing you can do with a pandemic, in addition to social distancing rules and thoughtful policy, is get people doctors and medicine. That's how you respond to a pandemic, not with surveillance tools that can't meet the actual need of the legitimate, clear and present danger. There is a threat to national security. It's nothing that the Patriot Act is going to stop. And the idea that we've been drinking snake oil instead of actually taking our medicine is, I think, a very revealing exposure of the failures of the corporate system that Nancy Pelosi promotes and entrenches. If we really were serious about national security in a pandemic, we would be emphasizing universal health care. And the fact that we're not, I think, is frankly disqualifying at a time like this.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because Joe Biden still does not support Medicare for all. He says single payer is not the solution to this, and there's a thing called Cobra in his most recent. There's a thing called Cobra for all the people who are losing their insurance now. Do you think that's enough?
It's not enough by a long shot. I mean, Cobra is even only accessible to people who had jobs right before in the first place, and it's wildly expensive, as we should expect, right? The entire edifice of our healthcare policy is geared toward putting money in the pockets of pharmaceutical and health insurance companies. And the increases in the premiums under the ACA prove the point, right? The whole structure of the Affordable Care Act is to penalize people through the tax system if they don't buy private health insurance with no public option. And the fact that we are forced to buy insurance on a private market makes us all effectively subject to the arbitrary pricing whims of health insurance corporations, and the rates have predictably gone through the roof. If you compare health insurance premiums, setting aside the ongoing, seemingly limitless increases over time, and you add to that co-payments, you add to that the deductibles that people remain responsible for, even if they're lucky enough to have health insurance, all of that together is basically a yoke around the neck of the middle class and working class Americans who are struggling to get on their feet in the face of both a public health crisis and an economic crisis. These are real needs, and Cobra doesn't meet it at all. It doesn't provide universal health care. It doesn't make sure that people who need treatment for COVID or other disorders get access to them. It doesn't ensure that the medicine is more widely available. All the expansion of Cobra does is double down on the predatory obligation of people to be reliant on a private market for health insurance that everyone else in the industrialized world around this entire planet enjoys as a matter of right. And I would ask, why do Americans settle for not having the same rights as other people? And it's, I think we don't get asked that question much because we don't have people in Congress reminding us that we have fewer rights than our neighbors in other countries. But the very same countries that the president derides are countries that treat their citizens better. And I, as an American, am too proud in this country to let us settle for scraps.
So Shahid, this all seems very reasonable and realistic to me. It makes sense that in the middle of that a national healthcare system would provide a bulwark against future pandemics. Why is it so hard to get through in Washington?
Because Washington is ruled by capitalists and wealthy people, landlords in particular, who guard their own class interests. I've often wondered how different might the debate in Washington be if the Democrats had a leader who was an activist, someone like Barbara Lee, or at least a constitutionalist, someone like Ro Khanna, or perhaps in the future, hopefully somebody from the squad, right? Like an Ilhan Omar. There are voices in Congress who champion our community's issues. And unfortunately, they labor under the thumbs of congressional leadership that serves corporations and Wall Street first. That's why it's hard to get anything sane through Washington, is because Wall Street runs Washington. And one of the ways that Wall Street runs Washington is by having seized San Francisco's voice in the House. That's what Nancy Pelosi represents, is the co-optation of the nation's most progressive city in our nation's legislature by capital. And if we zoom back from precise, particular policy issues, that's the theme that I would describe our political moment as most vividly demonstrating, is we are living through the rejection of capital by people who want simply to have a chance to survive. We have been pushed to the brink of our species' potential extinction in the context of the climate crisis, let alone the pandemic. We have two species-wide existential threatening events, and corporate rule can suffice to address neither of them. In fact, corporate rule has ducked into the punch that both the climate catastrophe presents as well as the pandemic. And if we want to survive, particularly if we want to have any hope of thriving, we have to shrug off the yoke of predatory corporate rule and embrace a public policy paradigm that puts people and communities first. That's what this moment offers the opportunity for our country to do, and I'm excited to be a part of that.
So, do you also see this then as sort of a last chance, like for our civilization then? Because we are facing, for people at home, we are facing a climate catastrophe that is. This is just the beginning. The pandemic is bad. The climate catastrophe will be infinitely worse. I think by 2100, we're looking at possibly a 7-degree rise in average global temperatures, which is a shocking number. That threatens the global food supply. It threatens. These are temperatures that we have not seen for millions of years. That existed before human beings. So it's not a hospitable future. So do you think that obviously money has a lot of influence? I ask you that question as sort of a give me question, but so that people at home watching can understand that there is a lot of influence in DC from money. Do you see this moment as a make or break moment for us?
The only reason yes, and to make a very long story short, I would say that I think that hope remains. Hope remains eternal, but yes, we are running out of time. There's a great deal of urgency, and I don't just mean politically, I mean for our species to embrace alternatives that give our grandchildren a chance at survival. And I really wish that more parents particularly thought about their kids and their grandkids. And I think they do, but for some reason they keep, many of them keep voting either for Republicans or for corporate Democrats. And the key here, and I'll make this point again, Republicans and corporate Democrats will run your kids and our grandkids off a cliff. And it's not the cliff of the pandemic, it's the cliff of the climate catastrophe. And frankly, the future can't fight for itself today. It needs our solidarity today to defend it and preserve it. And I'm very committed to preserving that future, even if it means challenging corporate rule in the present. And too many people who put their careers first serve established power, and that is accumulated capital. That is Wall Street. That's what Pelosi has done. And I'm not here to serve my career. I'm here to serve people, our grandkids, who aren't here yet and can't defend themselves. And that's what I'm here. That's what I think the national movement to challenge capital is here for. That's what the climate justice movement is here for. It's what the economic justice movement is here for. There's an intersectional set of movements that are reinforcing each other, that are amplifying each other, that are cross-promoting each other. The very same people, in fact, are in all of these different movements. We have an intersectional movement to reclaim our future. I'm proud to be a part of it. And I would say that while I do feel a great deal of urgency, I'm hesitant to say that any particular election is our last stand, because we will always have chances to protect the future. The question is, do we do it in time to actually save it, or will we be fighting in the future to save pieces of it, the parts that remain? Right?
Well, what does saving it look like in the face of, because to some extent the climate catastrophe is inevitable, even if we stopped producing fossil fuels. There is certain.
It's here now.
It's here now. There's inevitability that it will get worse. So what does that what does it mean to save the
Save
future?
it. Yeah. I mean, just to be clear here, when we talk about the pandemic, and we can locate it in very much the same roots as the climate crisis. It wasn't particularly carbon pollution caused, but there is a very strong theory that it's a zoonotic plague, meaning one driven by habitat destruction. And habitat destruction is the very same thing driving climate chaos, right? So common roots to each of these problems. Saving the future looks like stopping the practices that exacerbate the climate crisis. So one of those key elements is a transition to 100% renewable energy. Another, and that's embodied in the Green New Deal. That's a big part of why so many of us are fighting for the Green New Deal, because it's a key part of preserving a viable future for the human race on the only planet that we have. There's another piece here that's important to grip, and that is to say to get there, we have to ensure that everybody gets to come along. That's why the just transition and the federal jobs guarantee are so important. But in the spirit of your question, saving the future might still look like a lot of people, unfortunately, living in crisis in the future. That might be the best that we can hope for, is people living in crisis, but that's better than a whole bunch of people not having a chance to live at all. And saving the future, I think at this point, looks like enabling as much of it, as many people, as many institutions, as many communities to thrive, to ensure as much biodiversity that we can. That will help ensure the viability over the long term of the food supply. Putting biodiversity first, putting environmental justice first, and retooling our social methods so that we're not privileging the accumulation of capital at the cost of killing human beings. We do that in too many places. We do that in healthcare. We do that in military contracting. We do that in fossil fuel extraction. Why do we incentivize human killing behavior? We don't have to do that. The market is a condition of the legal regime. We can enact policies to keep fossil fuels in the ground, to ensure that weapons manufacturers aren't running off with all our resources, to engineer new ways to kill people en masse, to ensure that medicine and doctors are widely available. These are tools that we can engineer in public policy. And the preceding policy, because it's put capital accumulation first, has ensured that fossil fuel companies can monetize and profit from killing future generations. They've ensured that that weapons manufacturers can make hand over fist ensuring and promoting international conflict. They've ensured that the doctors, and particularly health insurance company executives, will reap in record profits even while there's an unprecedented public health disaster unfolding under our feet. It doesn't have to be that way. These are simply acts of Congress with the political will, meaning after we replace centrist careerists with people with voices like mine, like Bernie Sanders, like the Squad, when we put those voices in place, we can make better decisions that keep people alive. At least they keep more people alive, even if struggle is something that we are already destined for because of the failed decisions of the past. We can at least mitigate that suffering. We can seek climate resiliency projects. We can do everything we can to limit the catastrophe and to prepare for it. And that's exactly what our current generation of ossified policymakers has affirmatively refused to do.
Well, Shahid, I always enjoy talking to you. I know that you have another interview that you're preparing for. I appreciate it. I hope you'll come back before the election. Obviously, that's many months away. I'm sure I'll see you again. Thank you for your candor and taking the time. And tell people where they can find you and how they can get involved.
Thank you, Walker. It's always great to be with you, and I'd love to join you again. Folks can learn more about our campaign or sign up to get involved online at www.shahidforchange.us or at Shahid for Change on any of the major social media platforms, on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Twitch.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a great time, your next interview, and best of luck to you.
Thanks, brother. Always good to be with you. Bye, Walker.